Let me try this again. Okay, so what is mass incarceration? According to the Oxford bibliographies, the phenomenon refers to the current American experiment in incarceration, which is defined by comparatively and historically extreme rates of imprisonment and by the concentration of imprisonment among young African American men and women living in neighborhoods of concentrated disadvantages. So basically, mass incarceration in cities that have mainly financial disadvantages, disadvantages in life, lack of jobs, etc., etc. So I'm combining my first two sources because they kind of overlap with each other. They are the 13th documentary produced by Ava DuVernay on Netflix and chapter 1 of the new Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. So basically, the 13th documentary basically starts off saying that America holds 5% of the world's population and 25% of the world's prisoners, which basically means that our prisons are clearly overpopulated compared to what the actual population is. So, what is the 13th Amendment? The 13th Amendment basically says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States, or any place subject to their jurisdiction. So basically, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery unless you are in prison. So it's like it abolished slavery, but it didn't. So basically, before race came into play, slavery did start out as an economic system. And with abolishing slavery, that left the South financially unstable. And in the Jim Crow, it states that white Southerners were desperate to find other ways to use free labor in order to keep Black people oppressed. So because Black people were being used for free labor, abolishing slavery meant that they had nobody to work for them. And because it was an economic system, that left the South in like a financial frenzy. So after the Civil War, African Americans were being arrested in masses for small, petty crimes. So with Black people being arrested, that allowed the government to create forced labor all over again to rebuild the South. So after that whole period, then we come into a new period where false imagery was used to depict Black people as animals that needed to be controlled, especially by law enforcement. In the 13th documentary, it states how the birth of a nation, the movie, spread the growth of the KKK. And for those that don't know what Birth of a Nation is about, basically it was a movie where it depicted a Black man as this like animalistic rapist towards white women, towards a white woman, and the KKK was the law enforcement, pretty much. So with the growth of the KKK and how they were treating Black people, that's when Black communities from the South started to scatter throughout the country, which is why today we have predominantly Black communities, because generations and generations of people flocked to all these different places. So like Oakland, Chicago, Detroit, Compton, et cetera, et cetera. Now, because, you know, white people didn't like Black folks during that time, because they scattered to these places with no financial help, which put them in generations and generations of poverty, right? So when open terror on Black people was outlawed, the Jim Crow laws made segregation legal. So during the Jim Crow era, you know, civil rights leaders, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Black Panthers, Rosa Parks, all these people were being arrested like clockwork because civil rights leaders were painted as criminals for breaking the Jim Crow laws, not leaving a whites only restaurant on time, looking at a white person the wrong way, things like that. So every little thing that they saw was breaking the Jim Crow laws, and Black people were going to get arrested for it. So crime itself didn't officially start to rise until the 1970s with the law and order and war on drugs rhetoric. So basically, drugs became a crime issue instead of a health issue, especially in Black communities. So during the war on drugs epidemic, it was crack in the inner cities versus the rich cities, and they were being treated very differently, and we can still see that today. So with the war on drugs, mass incarcerations and harsh sentencings were happening during in the inner cities because of the war on drugs epidemic and how crack was put on like a double standard between Black people and white people. So going back to it's a crime issue instead of a health issue. Then the three strikes law was created, which easily ended up overpopulating prisons. Mandatory sentencing became a part of the three strikes law, and bail was always expensive. So when it comes to the three strikes law and mandatory sentencing, three strikes, you go to prison and there's a mandatory sentence that you have to serve. And committing, I guess, like three petty crimes is quite frankly something that's really easy to do. So with these mandatory sentencing, the two main cases that came was the Khalif Browder case and the Central Park 5 case. So in the Khalif Browder case, Khalif Browder was a Black man in New York, and he was arrested and sentenced for stealing a backpack, which he was actually innocent. And then in the Central Park 5 case, five innocent young Black and brown boys at the time were convicted of raping a white woman. And because of the mandatory sentencing, they had to serve time in prison. And because bail is extremely outrageous, cases like Khalif Browder, he was basically sitting in prison because he couldn't afford bail. Same thing with the with the Central Park 5 case. And 97% of these cases don't go to trial. So basically what ends up happening is you have a whole bunch of people just sitting behind bars because they can't afford bail. And on the other side of that is the idea of taking plea deals, which is basically you end up admitting to a crime that you didn't commit. And basically what happens is attorneys and like lawyers, they basically tell you if you admit to this crime, you can serve a smaller amount of your original time. But in most cases, that doesn't end up happening because as long as there is a confession to the crime that was claimed to be committed, the only thing that really matters is to make sure that they serve the amount of time that was originally requested. And so when people don't take these plea deals, like Khalif Browder and the group in the Central Park Five, is basically seen as like disrespect, because the courts are offering you less time if you commit than not committing and you end up serving, like a life sentence. Um, so that also caters into the idea of mass incarceration because the average person doesn't want to commit to a crime that they know they didn't commit. So they would just rather wait out their time, knowing that they're innocent, instead of painting a false picture for reality. So before we get into the question, is there any comments, questions, concerns? Okay. So the question that I came up with was if the 13th Amendment abolished slavery completely with no loopholes or anything, just straight up abolished all types of slavery, do you think mass incarceration would still be a problem? And me, I think it still would be because even though it would abolish slavery completely, having somebody behind bars takes them out of society. So as long as people are still thinking that Black people are like these violent, crazy people, uh, generations of racist lawyers and law enforcement are going to want to put these people in a place where they aren't, a harm to society. So that's what I think.
I think the no, yeah, no. I think the rhetoric being used throughout, the beginning of the abolishment of slavery was still very detrimental to people of color, especially African Americans. To touch back on what you said, The Birth of a Nation, that film was shown in the president's private office, like screening, and the president at the time said it was history written with lightning, he said, and the film itself, it depicts what would have happened if the Confederates won the Civil War, essentially, and, this maritime era of just, happy-go-lucky Southerners who still had access to the side of owning slaves would have won. So it's just this romanticized vision that white Southerners had at the time, and with the loss of the Civil War, I think it created this vacuum in the South, like you said, and which is why with the 13th Amendment being written the way it was, it still allowed for generations of people to still feel the effects of it, even though technically it was abolished. So, to come back to it, even if the 13th Amendment was written without any loopholes, I still think the rhetoric being used at the time would have still, influenced how African Americans were treated, especially in the criminal justice complex. So, without a doubt, I think it would still have affected it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. On to our next source. So I found this source called The Social and Moral Cost of Incarceration by Dorothy E. Roberts. It wasn't really a website. It was more of like a book blog website type of thing. And basically, what she's talking about is there are three theories that explain the harms of mass incarceration on the Black community, being damages of social networks. It distorts social norms and destroys social citizenship. So, with social network, she basically paints the picture of consider what the clustering of imprisonment means for young people living in inner cities. Um, and the chances of being removed from a community due to a prison term mounts up to the number of people he or she knows who are incarcerated over time. So basically, you have a young person living in like Chicago, and over time, the amount of people that this young person knows who has served a prison time, who is currently serving a prison time, it escalates and it continues to grow from when they're like 5 to when they're 25. Um, and that can put a damper on that individual, because usually in inner cities, it's families, and Black families are extremely big. Um, it's people they grew up with, people they go to school with, people they work with. Um, so, damaging of social networks starts with the family level and communities where families of prisoners live. So it creates a financial strain on families due to the need of maintaining contact and supporting those who are incarcerated. Because believe it or not, it does cost money to care for an incarcerated person. Um, and the longer that person is incarcerated, the more money that is being spent on that person. And back to a previous point that I made, how Black communities basically grew up in generations of financial instability. Um, that puts an even more strain on families and communities. Um, and these consequences also fall on children with incarcerated parents. So even with contact, um, um, there's still a parental disruption, because the parent can no longer physically or mentally take care of their child. So even with, like weekend visits and writing letters and, the child visiting their parent, there's still that parental gap of, like going out to the movies or something like that. Um, so what tends to happen is because there's a parental disruption in the family, the child, um, it, the there is a lot of emotional distress on the child. So it can lead to depression, feeling of neglect because, the parents there instead of here, anger, anxiety, and problems in school. Um, because, parents are the comforting outlet for a lot of kids. And as long as that comforting outlet isn't there, they have no way to, I guess, come to terms with their emotions, right? So every little thing can make them upset.
I feel like
Uh,
you psychoanalyzed me.
um, so um, with social norms, um, there's often a distrust in law enforcement. Um, because a lot of times what happens is when you live in communities where people are being arrested like clockwork, um, for even small crimes, a lot of the times, even we see it today, they don't want to be criminalized when they're the ones who are the victim. Um, so they feel like law enforcement doesn't really help. Um, and with this idea, basically what happens a lot of times in inner cities, they call 911, but the police take over 2 hours to get there when they're down the street. So it's like, why would I call the police when they're not going to get here on time anyways? Um, and then it's, um, I know that there's problems with the law enforcement and Black people. And if I call 911 on a crime, possibility is they're going to think that I'm the one who did it instead of actually solving the problem. Um, so, and then social control in communities is hard to maintain when mass incarceration rates are high. Um, this happens because communities tend to become unorganized with poverty rates and lack of jobs. Um, the social control in communities becomes hard to maintain, and with high mass incarceration rates, again, high poverty rates, which oftentimes leads to gang violence, which is something that communities are still having a very hard time to tackle, because when you have children whose parents are incarcerated, they want to find a place of belonging. So what they're going to do is they're going to join a gang, so that way they at least have somebody who they feel like cares about them. Um, and then that grows into a whole entire different problem between gangs and rivalries and all of that. Um, so the last one with social citizenship, the incarcerated person is subject to collateral denial of citizenship rights, privileges, and benefits. Majority of states, convicts, um, don't have the right to vote, um, which is a big, what's the word? Which is a big result for a lot of things. And then there's a lack of job opportunities because once you come out of prison, there's a lack of educational skills required for a lot of jobs. Um, Social connections are limited because you're basically in four walls for a majority of your life, and job skills are limited. And then there's the social isolation aspect. For a lot of people, depression, anxiety, and anger come up, and being released back into society becomes hard for a lot of people because you go in, as a 17-year-old, and you come out when you're 30. The world, things adapt and things change. And because the way the prison system is set up, um, the jobs that are there aren't necessarily jobs that are going to equip them for real life situations. Um, and when it comes to the mental aspect of being an inmate, for a lot of people, prison is like a survival of the fittest type of situation. So you have to learn how to fend for yourself. And sometimes, that means, sleeping with one eye open. So, you're always paranoid. And then in cases like the Khalif Browder case, a lot of inmates are spending days, weeks, months in solitary. Um, so what happens is basically, you're locked away in this box for, days at a time. And it starts to mess with your head because you're not interacting with anybody. And a lot of times people who are in solitary get treated worse by guards, because, that's like the lowest level in the prison. So my question is, if prison if prisons took certain aspects from real life and implemented them for inmates to use, would the transition back into the real world be easier? So, like actual jobs that will be able to benefit them, um, educational programs, or like extracurricular activities. And I think it potentially could help the transition back into the real world. Of course, not 100%, but more than what it does now, especially if somehow prisons implemented actual profiting jobs that allow growth. Um, and, with like extracurricular activities, being able to interact with people. And I know that a lot of prisons, there are educational programs, um, but it's only like your AA or like these small degrees that in real life nobody really cares about. Um, so I think it could help potentially. Um, yeah.
No, definitely. When I was getting my undergraduate at San Francisco State University, one of my field trips was to San Quentin uh, Penitentiary. It's actually where my father is still staying. I learned that it became one of the top prisons in California, in the nation, actually, that inmates want to go to because of all the new emerging social programs that are growing from that one prison. It used to be a maximum security prison, but it's scaled down to minimum security. And in one of the sessions we had there, we sat inmate, student, inmate, student, inmate, student in a big circle. And we broke off into, smaller groups and, just sharing each other's stories. And, from the feedback I heard from my class, a lot of it was just, there was a lot of apprehension, going into a place like this and walking across the yard and, having all these eyes looking at you. But what came out of it was a lot of my classmates understanding that yes, they're inmates, but they're also people with real stories and, with real tragedies in their lives too. And I got the chance to share my story with them. A couple of them actually have met my father. I have yet to actually, but I shared my story. I remember I broke down crying, and the craziest part about all of that was that people who were convicted of serious crimes, murder, the list goes on. They came up to hug me, and I would have never ever thought that possible prior to, experiencing this in San Quentin. So I definitely believe that, implementing more real life aspects into, prisons definitely help because, this group of people, of inmates, I should say, that were inside, they were there voluntarily. They weren't forced to do so. They were there because they wanted to, and they wanted to learn to change. They wanted to learn to understand the law. They wanted to learn why they were staying there and how they could better themselves upon being released. And I think recently, actually, in 2020, one of the good things that have happened this year is that Proposition 17 was passed, which allows incarcerated individuals who are on parole can now vote. So they don't have to wait their entire parole or they don't have to serve their entire parole to finish voting. So given the next election cycle, we can possibly see people who are still on parole have the chance to vote. Because one of the things that prison does take away from you is one of your constitutional rights to vote. So I think if California did anything good this year, it would be the passing of Prop 17. So I think we're definitely seeing slow but steady progress towards a more restorative justice approach rather than a punitive justice approach. It's probably going to take a long time to see any real change, but I think this, for example, is one of the many things that get the ball rolling.
Yeah, I agree with most of what you said and what you Cleo. But me personally, I believe that the transition needs to be more focused on the mental health than anything else, because you have these people that's locked in cells locked away for so long and they're used to this, then you bring them back to reality and expect them to act normal again. They say it takes, 30 days for something to become a habit? The lowest sentence I can think of is 30 days. So if I get used to doing this for a certain amount of time, gotta wake up, do this, do that, do that. It's a set schedule. You send me back to a world that I haven't been in so long. Like we said earlier, things change. You have to adapt to it. Some things you can't adapt to as fast as others.
That's right.
But mental health is like a key thing. That's the main thing that keeps everybody balanced. You cannot do nothing in this world without your mental health, without your sanity.
That's right.
Educational programs are cool. Jobs are amazing. But in order to do anything with that degree, with that job, you have to have your mental health has to be stable.
That's right.
Agree.
Institutionalization is definitely one of the biggest things that I learned when I was talking to these other incarcerated individuals within San Quentin. You know, we had people who were once there come back in to speak about it. And one of the most overwhelming things they said they experienced when they were released was their freedom of choice. Like you were saying, Darren, you know, you're fed at a certain time. You're told to go to sleep at a certain time. Everything is done for you.
Mm-hmm.
But I remember the individual that I was speaking with, he said, you know, he walked into McDonald's and it was like, I can order anything I want from this menu. It's not something that's given, you know, and now take that and apply it to everything in life. Like I can walk here without being told what to do. I can go to sleep whenever I want. And it's that kind of overwhelming, you know, realization that, you know, I've been institutionalized for so long and it's a way of life for me now. And that, you're very right, that causes individuals to revert back to certain patterns. You know, the gentleman I was talking to, he said it took him about a month for him to stop showering with his underwear on and flip-flops on, because he still felt like he needed to do that in his own home where he was by himself. And he said over time he eventually felt more comfortable to do that. But it's that institutionalization that takes a toll on the mind, not just the body.
Agreed.
Okay, so next source was from this website called ACLU Solutions, and basically they had some reforms on how to fix the mass incarceration problem in America. So reform number one was to eliminate incarceration as a penalty of certain classes of low-level nonviolent offenses. So that would be offenses that are a result of mental illness, drug addiction, or first-class offenses. Because I've noticed a lot of the times first-class offenses, for some reason, often get large sentences, especially when they're petty crimes. So reform number two was strengthen cost-effective alternatives to incarceration and drug treatment programs. So basically, find ways for incarceration to be altered some type of way. Reform number three was to distinguish between the people who actually pose as a threat and those who are genuinely ready to re-enter society. And I feel like a lot of the times guards, fellow inmates, and courts are able to differentiate between the two, because you have the people who are always causing problems, people who are always harming other inmates, and then you have those who are reading books, you have those who are getting closer to a specific religion, those who have served the majority of their time with good behavior, things like that. And reform number 4 was require regular systemic evaluations of our criminal justice system, which I thought was really interesting, because, with systemic racism, it's systems, it's a part of the systems. Um, so I think that I don't know how exactly that would happen, being that it's within the system. So like you would have to like somehow track down all of the people who are giving these sentences purely because they don't want Black people out into society. Um, so basically, yeah, these reforms were made with the idea of trying to eliminate the mass incarceration system, find other outlets that could be used besides mass incarceration, um, things that would be more healthier and I guess help those who have committed small crimes, and then evaluate the system as a whole, um, because that's pretty much all um, incarceration is. It's a system that continues to do the same thing over and over and over again with no consequences. um, so my question was, with alternate treatment for the mentally ill and people who are addicted to drugs, would that cause a spike in those faculties? And what would happen if those faculties get overcrowded? My thoughts were that, in a sense, I feel like yes, um, those faculties would end up eventually being overcrowded, because now instead of arresting them and putting them in prison, you are putting them in rehab centers, in I guess like those psych ward places, which of course is a good thing, because me personally, I don't believe that a mentally unstable person should be behind bars to begin with, because that just makes them even more mentally unstable than they already are. And I believe that drug usage and drug addiction is a health issue, and it should not be seen as a crime issue. So yeah, I think if alternate if alternate places were created, I feel like they would be overcrowded eventually, and I feel like they would revert back to putting these people back into prison, which is something that um, any level-headed person doesn't want to see. Um, so I think, in a sense, it'd be good and bad, because eventually you're gonna have to put these people somewhere. Um, so that's what I think.
I think we're seeing that now in Oregon, where they have made Schedule One drugs, heroin, cocaine, other stuff like that, not necessarily legal to use, but they have diminished the punishment if you have if you are caught carrying. I think it's $100 fine, and you get a physical health evaluation. So this is definitely beginning to happen in a way, and I think as time goes on, we're going to see how that plays out, because California has yet to adopt something like that. And I think this talk of alternative measures talks into the whole defund the police argument that I've seen. And I think a lot of people who hear that upright don't understand what it entirely means. I think they think it means abolish the police, and you can have that opinion definitely, and that's totally up to you. What defund the police means is that they already do too much with so little training given. They are
Mm.
told to become mental health officers. They're told to restrain people. They are told to tell them to read them their rights. They are told to become crowd control officers, and they are already given very minimal training at best. What it means, in my opinion, and what I've seen, is to take away the funds that are used towards that and give them to other individuals or other facilities, such as mental health, rather than, if somebody's having a mental health episode, rather than calling the police, we can create a new system where somebody who's a trained mental health professional can talk to the individual. And, if perhaps the person is armed, maybe they can have a police escort. But what it means is just to redistribute the funds that go towards our police to create other facilities that can help certain individuals, to kind of lighten the load that the police already do, because it's been proven, through videos we've seen already, that they can't do everything. And if they're trying to do everything, they're not going to do it as right as they can. So, these instances where we have, police shootings, majority of them being Black and brown people being the victims, it's kind of hard to see that. And I do believe that we can have a more rehabilitative approach to criminal justice in this nation, but we have to start somewhere. And I think Oregon has just become the frontier of that, because it's the whole state that's allowed that. I know in California, they were thinking of the idea of having individuals, rather than, shooting up in the streets, for example, like heroin, they could go to a specific location, have a nurse check their drugs, and then they could use them. I think that is a little difficult to use, because there's a very thin line of, when are you feeding somebody's addiction and when are you trying to help. So I think that would be a little controversial, but what we're seeing in Oregon, I think, is definitely going to be the forefront of this rehabilitative approach, because the war on drugs is a mess. I mean, it was administered during the Nixon and Reagan era. I think Nixon was the person to coin the term, but Reagan turned his metaphorical war into a literal war on drugs, and he was oppressing individuals in mainly New York being the prime example, inner city African Americans in New York. And, it's still going on to today. It's what I tell my friends, it's like, it's basic economy. If there's a supply, there's going to be a demand. If people want drugs, there's going to be drugs. No matter how much you put into this, it's going to keep happening. So in my opinion, I think the war on drugs is a complete failure, and honestly, in all honesty, should be just abandoned in lieu of a more rehabilitative approach, because we've already had years and years on the war on drugs. And what has it done besides, increase spots in prisons for non-violent drug offenders? So.
Anybody else?
Said it all right there. Literally.
Okay. So the last source that I have is about Joe Biden on prison reform. With this source, basically, I was waiting until the election to see who was going to be president. If it was Trump, this would have been Trump on prison reform, but Joe Biden won. So it's Joe Biden on prison reform. So I got this information from his campaign website. Basically, what it states is that we can reduce the number of people incarcerated in this country while also reducing crime. And in doing so, we would use drug courts and treatment, again, instead of, just arresting them, and making sure that drugs are seen as a health problem instead of a crime problem. Reducing the number of incarcerated would reduce federal spending on the incarceration. So going back to the idea of, defunding the police, with this, it'd be defunding the prison system. And so those savings would be reinvested into communities impacted by mass incarceration. That would help them become financially stable. That would help them increase their job opportunities. That would help increase education enrollment, things of that nature. And then the website, it also states that the criminal justice system can't be just unless we root out the racial, gender, and income-based disparities in the system. So basically mass incarceration is indeed, it roots as a racial issue in this country, predominantly affecting the Black and Brown community. Um, and things like police brutality, the over policing in communities of color, racial profiling, and not being able to afford bail. All of these sorts of things are a result of mass incarceration. Police brutality, you know, they get arrested for whatever reason, for talking back to the police officer, for videotaping the incident, things like that. Over policing in communities of color. Basically, they target every little thing in the book, whether that's a drug deal or jaywalking. If they see a Black and brown person doing it, chances of you being arrested is very high. Racial profiling, things like stop and frisk, um, which easily leads into police brutality, because, nobody wants police officers bothering them for no reason. And then not being able to afford bail. Again, going back to a far point, people are sitting in prison because their families can't afford bail. And that's really the only reason that they're there. So, yeah. And then to prevent crime, opportunities would be provided. So, investing in educational opportunities with funding of low income families. Wants to eliminate mandatory minimums, and decriminalize the use of weed and expunge weed charges, eliminate the death penalty, and eliminate cash bail. So basically, all of the things that trickle down to mass incarceration, Joe Biden wants to eliminate. Investing in educational opportunities that would allow low-income families to go to school instead of resorting to drug dealing, and things of that nature. Eliminating mandatory minimums is pretty self-explanatory. There will no longer be oh, you committed this crime, so that means you have to serve this amount of time. And then decriminalize the use of weed and expunge weed charges, being that a lot of states now are beginning to legalize marijuana usage, but there's still a large number of Black and brown individuals who are currently serving life sentences for like having an ounce of weed in their car. Basically, what he wants to do is decriminalize the use of weed and then look and see who is in there for charges of weed and then get rid of them, which would decrease the mass incarceration rates by a lot. Eliminating the death penalty, basically eliminating the death penalty, either that person would serve a regular amount of sentencing, and that would also allow the innocent people on death row a fair chance with either serving a smaller prison sentence, and then that would also decrease the mass incarceration rates, because they're basically what the death penalty now has become is you're pretty much serving life anyways, because the list of people is so long that when they declare you as a death row inmate, you're just sitting there serving time anyways. And then eliminate cash bail. Basically, what cash bail is the amount of money that the court issues to get that person out of jail. And usually most cases. Again, these cases don't end up going to trial, and these cash bails are extremely outrageous. So the courts, they know what they're doing. Purposefully setting bail to, $500,000 for joyriding a car, things of that nature. So my question is, would eliminating the number of the incarcerated by providing opportunities for all actually help reduce crime? And I think it will in a lot of aspects, especially when you are funding education, and that gives, a lot of young people a place to go instead of just hanging out on the streets, which is where a lot of crime happens anyways. And then I think that would help reduce crime as well, because it begins to put families and communities of those incarcerated back into a spot where they feel comfortable in society, where they can live comfortably without having to worry about not having enough money to care for their incarcerated individual. So in a sense, I do believe that being able to provide opportunities for all would help eliminate or decrease crime.
Definitely. I'm hoping to see a lot of good in this new administration, in the president's office. Um, However, I don't want to discount Joe Biden, or I don't want to put him on a pedestal too much. What I've learned in my studies also is, and I'm sure it was brought up during the election race a lot too, as how he was one of the sponsors of the 1994 crime bill during the Bill Clinton era, which increased mandatory minimums for up to 5 years if you were caught with, I think, 500 milligrams of crack cocaine. And due to its cheaper price, it could be found and obtained very, very easily in inner city neighborhoods, again, in very populous areas. From this new administration, I think we're going to see some definite change. I can definitely see that he's had a change of heart when it comes to his views on crime, because this whole tough on crime rhetoric, was definitely utilized more so by Republican politicians. But as we see this shift of power from a more Republican, or definitely a Republican president, to a Democratic one, I think we're going to see more changes to that. And to mention what you said about the elimination of the death penalty too, one of the scariest facts I learned in my time at SF State was that up to 4% of people on death row are innocent, and we're talking about people's lives here. So it should be 0%. If you are convicted of a crime, there should be no percentage at all that you could be innocent. Yet we have people up to 4% who are innocent. And I think you guys might have heard of the Innocence Project before, where they have used newfound DNA to help prove people's innocence in multiple cases, and essentially rescued them from being put to death by the state. I don't know if you guys saw the election race, but we still have a lot of red states in the middle. So I think we're definitely going to have a contentious battle between the elimination of the death penalty, along with a lot of other stuff too. But under this new Biden administration, I'm hoping to see some of these changes be implemented in the future, especially with cash bail, because that's just outright favoritism towards those who have money. It's basically putting a price on your crime, and if you can pay it, then you don't have to stay in jail. Whereas if you do, you can stay up to 30 days in county jail waiting for your sentence. Unfortunately, that proposition was on the ballot in California, and I did vote to eliminate cash bail, but unfortunately it didn't pass. But again, I think with time we will see slow but definite change. We just have to keep making sure our voices are heard. And let's hope that under this administration we could see some positive change when it comes to the mass incarceration pandemic in the U.S.
Okay. So basically, these are my sources, and that has been the end. Are there any final questions, comments, anything you'd like to share?
I was very impressed. I didn't get to tell you because I don't want to tell you over social media, Cleo, but I was very impressed by what you and Hudson did in the wake of George Floyd's murder, and how you brought the whole community of, essentially Palo Alto, this, more so whitish neighborhood, together in a way, and, brought all these people out and peacefully protested, and it was something I was telling my girlfriend earlier, that, it takes a lot, not only courage, but just power in a sense to get these people to listen and to understand the issues that are plaguing, Black and brown people in this nation when it comes to interactions with the police. And I listened to your speech, I listened to Hudson's, and you guys have very powerful words, and I'm glad that I could help in any way. I hope you got a good grade on this assignment. I was in your shoes. Yeah, I was in your shoes maybe 6 or 7 months ago for my final project at SF State, and just wanted to pay it forward through this. So wanted to say thank you, and keep doing what you're doing. You're doing good stuff here, Cleo.
Thank you very much.
Of course.
Well, that is the end. Thank you, everybody, for taking the time out of your busy schedules to help me pass my class. It's very much appreciated.
Of course.
Of course. So how did this thing